Let me begin with a question for you. And the question is this: why is Trump president? How did that happen? Any ideas? The Russians, okay? Any corruption.
Failure of the Democratic Party to provide something else.
Failure of the Democratic Party, okay. Anything else? Racism, sexism, xenophobia. It runs much deeper than Trump. Since 2008, the Democrats have lost 917 state, local, and national offices. They've won a few back recently, but it's a huge shift in electoral politics. The vote loss, the switch in votes between Obama and Clinton, 500,000 of those Obama votes disappeared in Michigan, 290,000 in Pennsylvania, 222,000 in Wisconsin. That's the whole election. Republicans now control 33 of the 50 governorships. And they control 7 state legislatures. If they get to 36, they can call a constitutional convention. And this is not a small matter. If they do that, they can change the Constitution to put in immigration controls, outlaw trade unions. They can do all kinds of things. It could be our worst nightmare. And the Koch brothers and others are aiming for that. They want to see government fail so that people will be so upset that they'll go for this constitutional convention. So we're headed off a cliff, a much bigger cliff than Trump. So there are two things that I think are driving this that I want to address today. First one is runaway inequality that my brother brought up in the back. Yes, that'd be the first. We think that from the right, Trump, and from the left, Sanders, both were feeding from the anger around runaway inequality. And the second reason is that social justice advocates, we as social justice advocates, are not that well organized. When all of this has happened on our watch. Those of you my age, our whole lifetime of social activism has failed. We've made progress on a few issues, but in general, look what's happened. This incredible movement to the right. So there might be something, unless we don't believe we have any impact at all, there might be something about the way we're organized. And I am happy to say that you here in Staten Island are organizing in the right way. And we're going to look at that more carefully towards the end of this. So the first question we always ask is, how big is the pay gap between the top 100 CEOs and the average worker? When you ask the American people this in polls, they will say it's roughly 45 to 60 to 1. For every $1 earned by the average worker, a top CEO earns $45 to $60 in income. That's a pretty big gap. That's one way to view it. I like to view it this way. If you can afford one home, they can afford 45 homes. If you can one car, 45 cars. If you could raise one family, they could raise 45 families. It's a lot of money. So this is the other interesting thing. If you ask them, the American people, what they think the gap ought to be, this is interesting. A strong Republican will say 12 to 1. A strong Democrat will say 5 to 1 for an average of 7 to 1. So they think it's 45 to 1. They want it to be 7 to 1. Let's take a look at what it really is. They were right. It was 45 to 1 in 1970. Now let's take a look at what's happened. For this decade, it's averaging about 800 to 1. Think about that. You can raise one family, maybe. They could raise 800. It's an enormous gap. Now think about what this means for the average person. If they think the gap ought to be 7 to 1, and it's really 800 to 1, you can imagine the anger that would be there once they realize this is what the world looks like. So, the first thing is to understand whether or not this is unique to the United States or happening all over the globe? Well, it's a global phenomena, but when it comes to leading the world in something, we lead the world in the gap. Nobody else comes close. Why is this happening? How do we understand this? It takes us to look at something a little bit technical. This next chart that comes up is the only one that's going to be on your final exam. So I want us to look at it very closely. We start with a red line. And if you can't see it in the back, we go from 1947 till today. And this red line is productivity. Now, productivity is an interesting measure. It measures the sum total of all our skill, our infrastructure, educational structure, worker effort, management effort, scientific effort. All that comes together to create productivity. And the way they measure it is interesting. It measures how much is produced per hour of labor. Not how much we pay labor, but how much stuff, goods and services, can the economy produce per hour of labor. We produce roughly 3 times as much per hour of labor now as we did in 1947. And the reason this is so important is productivity is the way you measure wealth of nations. This can be used to make a high standard of living for all of us. When productivity is rising, ever rising, you have enough stuff to have a very prosperous society, and one that is healthy, and one that is good to the environment. You can do all that when you have all this technical know-how, organization, infrastructure, and so on. Now, productivity and wages are supposed to be connected. And this next little line shows that from 1947 until the early 1970s, productivity and wages were directly connected. Every time productivity went up, so did real wages. After you take out inflation, so the real buying power for the average American of all shades and colors went up year by year by year. This was the post-war boom. I saw this happen in my own family, working class people whose lives got a little better year by year by year. I was in graduate school right in the early 1970s, and they taught us this was an iron law. It had to happen. The 2 lines had to rise together. Well, no sooner did I graduate, boom, they repealed the iron law. No more iron law. The 2 lines split apart. And they split apart so severely that the average working person in real buying power earns less now than they did in 1977. Now, that is some gap. And that's the gap we have to understand. We understand that, we're going to understand what's happening in our society and why so many of the issues that we all care so deeply about are connected. They're not separate. They're not accidental. By the way, close your eyes for a second and think about your paycheck. If the 2 lines stayed together, your paycheck would be double what it is today. Double. Or you could work half the number of hours. Now, open your eyes now. I don't want you to fall asleep. The average weekly wage and real buying power would be double what it is today. Or you could work half the hours for the same amount of pay. That's the standard of living that we're not getting, that we were getting. What happened? That's the mystery that we have to solve. Okay, so if you look at the newspapers and the TV, they will tell us that every day there's an article about technology, that robots are coming in, that computers are coming in, and that's why wages have stalled. Because unless you're in the high-tech industry, you just don't have the skills anymore to get good pay. Well, there was an excellent study done by the International Labor Organization to try to figure out why that wage gap actually exists. And they said, yes, technology is part of the problem. 10% of the problem. We're also told that globalization is another reason wages are low, because now we're competing against low-wage labor all over the world, and that was a new phenomena. And this ILO, International Labor Organization study, said, yep, that's a problem too. About 20% of the problem has to do with globalization. And of course, we know there have been attacks on labor, attacks on the public sector, attacks on social programming, and that too is part of the problem. That counts for about a quarter of the problem. But then the biggest one was something I never heard of. They said the biggest part of the problem is something called financialization. 45% of the problem of the wage gap is caused by something called financialization. What the heck is that? Oh, by the way, I'd written 2 books on finance before I saw this study, and I didn't know this was going on. And what they mean is the countries that have the biggest Wall Street type operations have the most inequality, have the most wage stagnation. So there's something about Wall Street that has to do with this. And that's the story we're going to walk through now. Okay, so the first thing we look at is Wall Street wages. And they've done quite nicely. They've risen along with productivity, even faster than productivity. Those are wages on Wall Street. Here, wages in the rest of the economy. My goodness, they went flat. And if you compare the 2 charts, there's the productivity wages on the right, there's Wall Street, non-Wall Street on the left. They look the same. So there's something about the money going to Wall Street. Somehow money that used to go to us goes to Wall Street. How did that happen? How does so much wealth end up on Wall Street and with the CEOs? Okay, let me take you on a ride. The first piece of the ride is something called the Better Business Climate Model. This was, in the 1970s, the economy was looked like it was falling apart. The Vietnam War created inflation. Then you had unemployment when they tried to deal with inflation. Then you had 2 Arab oil boycotts that quadrupled the price of oil and then doubled it again. And you had unemployment and inflation going on at the same time. Politicians were hungry for a new philosophy to deal with this, new policies, and they got one from a group of economists that had been around for a while, led by Milton Friedman, University of Chicago. And academics call this neoliberalism. We call it the better business climate because the word liberal confuses things. And it's a philosophy of the economy that both political parties bought in the 1970s, and for the most part, both political parties still buy it. Very simple philosophy. You cut taxes on the wealthy, in general, but mostly on the wealthy because they'll invest it. You cut regulations, and unions are the biggest regulations, so you want to cut them. You want to cut government social spending so that nobody gets anything for nothing. They'll be hungrier to go out there to work hard. And you want to privatize as much government as possible because the private sector is more efficient than the public sector. You do all this so that profits and investment will rise, and then all boats will rise. This sounds, when you listen to politicians, they more or less say this in some form or another. You can see ads from Cuomo, New York State ad, come to New York, we'll cut your taxes, we'll create a better business climate for you, and so on. Now, we call this trickle-down economics, et cetera, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is that little cut in regulations when they did it in the 1970s, nobody had any idea what the impact of this would be on Wall Street. You see, up till that point, we had our foot on the neck of Wall Street, all the way from 1933 until the late 1970s. They couldn't do anything without government supervision. And so Wall Street was a quiet, sleepy place. You didn't make that much more money there than you did working anywhere else. Once we took our foot off their neck and got into this deregulation philosophy, all hell broke loose. And nobody was watching, except Wall Street knew what it was doing, and here's what they did. There had always been a group of people around who were looking to figure out how they could kind of game the system. And back then, we called them corporate raiders. They would buy up companies and then try to sell them again and make a profit from doing that. These corporate raiders were tightly controlled until this deregulation set in. And then what they realized they could do was they could buy up company after company using borrowed money. A little bit of their own, borrowed the rest, buy up the company, and figure out how to make money off it. Well, the key of what they did was when they borrowed all that money to buy the company, they made the company pay it back, not them. Think about that. How many people here bought a car with a car loan? Who pays back the loan, you or the car? You made a mistake. If you bought Avis or Hertz, they would pay back the loan, not you. So this is the new game that they started to play. Everybody's company, I'll bet you everybody who's working here, if you work in the private sector, your company has been bought up through this process at some time or another. So what they do is they buy up the company. As soon as they close the deal, they make the company give them a special dividend. They almost break even. Right off the top, they get their down payment back. They give some to the CEOs and the bankers, and then they make the company pay it all back. Okay, so now you just bought a company. How are you going to make money from it? Well, you need somebody to run it. You're not going to run it. You're going to have somebody to run it who's going to run it the way you want them to run it. And the way you want them to run it is so that they extract as much wealth out of the company as possible. The way you do that is you change the way that they get paid. You now pay them, instead of giving them salary and bonus, you give them stock incentives. And that's exactly what they started to do. They gave them more and more and more and more stock incentives. They gave them so many stock incentives that today, only 5% of a CEO's, this is all CEOs, pay comes from salary and bonuses, and virtually all the rest are stock incentives. So think about this. Imagine, everyone in this room for a second, you're a CEO, you're a CEO, you're a CEO. And you go to work every day, and you're going to get paid in stock incentives. What are you going to do? What's the only thing that you're going to care about? You're only going to be paid in stock incentives. What are you going to do? Make the stock go up. So if we had more time, and this is a workshop, the kind of which we hope to introduce you to by the end of this, you'd be discussing ways to make the stock go up. And all of us would be terribly ingenious. We'd be talking about how to cut costs and how to make a better product and get a bigger market and all that kind of stuff. That's not what they did. What they figured out, and this was amazing, they figured out in this deregulated environment, they could take the company's money, go into the stock market, buy back the company's own shares. And by doing that, they increase the price of the stock. How does that work? What's your name? Sarah and I own a $1 million company. 2 shares. Sarah has one, I have one. Each share is worth $500,000. Sarah, in her wisdom, decides to buy me out. She buys my share, she retires it. Now there's 1 share left. How much is that share worth? This works with millions of owners. You reduce the number of shares, all the ones left are worth a little more. That's one way the stock goes up. The other is, if I go into the marketplace and want to buy billions of shares, I have to bid up the price a little bit, the share goes up. This guarantees the share goes up. It's called stock buybacks. That's what they're called now. Before 1982, this was considered illegal, and it was regulated. Why? Because it was considered stock manipulation, the kind of stock manipulation that caused the crash of 1929. It's happening now, it's happening yesterday, and it's going to happen tomorrow. What companies, if you're a CEO and you're paid with stock incentives, what you're going to do is take as much money as you can out of the company, go into the marketplace, buy up more shares, and drive up the price of the stock, which is the way you get paid and which is the way the corporate raider gets paid. Stock manipulation became legalized in 1982 with just a rule change under the Reagan administration and the Security Exchange Commission. So, you think this is a little phenomenon? Well, in 1981, 2% of all corporate profits went to stock buybacks. Before the crash in 2007, 74% of all corporate profits went to stock buybacks, and now we're up to about 60%. It stopped during the crash, and now it's going up again. That 60% of all the corporate profits in the whole economy go to stock buybacks. This is no little thing. No little thing. So, where do they get the money from to do this? Again, they go to work every day. How do I get money for stock buybacks? That's what they do. And what they do is squeeze the hell out of the company. They downsize through layoffs. They ship production abroad. They sell off product lines and divisions. They speed up production. They raid pension funds or discontinue them. By the way, I'm giving the whole list of what they wanted to do during the Verizon strike to the Verizon workers. Cut wages and benefits. And the whole philosophy of corporate America changes from retain and reinvest to downsize and distribute. We call this financial strip mining. Not financialization, that's kind of a weird word. Financial strip mining, they're stripping the wealth out of the company and putting it in their own pockets. And the outcome of all this is that's why average wages stagnate, that's why financial and CEO income skyrocket, and that's why good jobs and benefits have been declining. This is a mess, and this mess is a direct result of that better business time philosophy and the deregulation of finance. And of course, now they're deregulating it even more. Okay, so that's the private sector, more or less. But we need to talk about how it impacts the community, because it has an enormous impact on the community in ways that I think, at least I didn't put all the pieces together until I started working on this project with this gang out here. All right, so how does it impact our communities and public sector workers? The first thing to know is that companies started running up a lot of debt, right? Because they'd be bought out. All the debt would be put on top of these companies because all they were being bought out with borrowed money. And corporate debt went from nothing to, what is it now? $6 trillion. $6 trillion of corporate debt. Now, the interesting thing about corporate debt from a corporation point of view is the interest payments on corporate debt are tax deductible. Who are they paying taxes to? Well, federal, state, and local government. And they're paying, look what happens to what they're doing to state and local taxes. The corporate contribution crashes. The more they buy out other companies, the more they run up debt, the less they pay in taxes, and the amount of corporate taxes falls in half. So what you have now is you have state and local governments that are always gasping for air, always looking to borrow, looking to find ways to build bridges, to repair roads, to build schools. They're always desperate. There's always some sort of a big crunch going on. The other problem is that when you get rich, how many people here have more than $10 million in assets? Okay. What do you do with your money if you have more than $10 million in assets? What do you do? Hide it abroad. You don't have to pay taxes. You can move your money offshore. No one's going to really stop you. There's tax havens all over the place. Wall Street's designed to help you. They call it wealth management. They'll help you find a tax shelter in the Cayman Islands. Oh, by the way, you don't have to put your money in the Cayman Islands. That's just a bank account in New York. You just move it from your American account to your Cayman Islands account, still sitting in New York. Now, this is a big enterprise. We are losing about $150 billion a year in taxes from these offshore accounts. And you can see, where's New York? Oh, number 2. We're losing how much? We're losing something like $4.3 billion a year. Imagine what that would do for the school system. Anyway, thank you. When you put all this together, what happens is you have the most perverse tax payments at a state and local level. We're always in a fiscal crisis. We don't have enough money for anything. Here's the rich aren't paying, corporations aren't paying. Who's paying? This is the tax brackets at state and local government. This is how, if you add up all the state and local taxes across the country, this is who pays. If we had a progressive tax system, the poor would be paying the smallest percentage, the rich would be paying the biggest percentage. That's what progressive taxation is supposed to be. Here's what we have. The richer you are, the less you pay in terms of percentage. The rich aren't paying, The poor can't pay anymore. It all falls on the middle income, and they say, we don't want to pay anymore. That's the recipe for a fiscal crisis that never will go away in the richest country in the history of the world. That's our tax system. Now, we're supposed to be able to take care of this by giving people, corporations, a tax holiday, right? They're going to bring back all their money. Apple's going to bring back all their money. All these companies are going to bring back all their money. That's what was in this new tax bill. Well, we have an idea what they're going to do with their money. What do you think they're going to do with their money when they bring it back? Yes. An MIT Harvard study looked at the tax holiday we gave in 2004, where $200 billion actually was brought back. And what was supposed to happen, they were going to hire more workers, invest in the U.S., fund R&D, and what they did instead was, for every dollar that came back, 60 to 92 cents went to increase corporate salaries and stock buybacks. That's where the money's going to go. Now, to keep this whole system together, they've got to be politically aware. They've got to invest politically. So let's take a look at the investment. This is the 2016 elections. Let's see how much money was put up by different groups. Here's what Labor put up. $57 million, that's a lot of money. Single issues like environment, women's rights, and so on, they put up $88 million. Here's what corporations and finance put up. Almost $400 million. So is it a wonder that the rules are getting written so that they can do more stock buybacks, they can have more tax cuts, and more of the tax burden is going to fall on us. Now, this perpetual fiscal crisis is very interesting. We still need somehow to finance our roads, our bridges, building schools, and so on. We still have to do it. So how do we do it? Well, an interesting study was done in the city of Los Angeles. And lo and behold, where do you think they get their money to maintain their streets and roads? Where do you think they get it from? They borrow it from Wall Street. They have to go back to the loan shark that caused the problem to begin with. So they go to Wall Street and they have to pay principal and interest, and they have to pay vigorish up front, points up front, in addition to interest and principal. The fees that they pay in 1 year, in 2014, in Los Angeles alone was $334 million, which was twice as big as what they spent on all their roads. And this is happening all over the country. Our state and local governments are being strip mined by Wall Street. This is financial strip mining at work. Now, enough with the economics. Now let's deal with the social consequences of this. This is not just the change of the economy. It's changed our heads. It's changed the way we think about what's right and wrong and what we should do. So, for example, it is understood today that if you want an education, you're supposed to go into debt. This only started to change when Bernie Sanders brought this up in the 2016 election. I don't want to take too much credit for it, but he stole that position entirely from me. When I was growing up, if you wanted to go to a public university and you had a summer job, any state school you could cover tuition. If you were lucky enough to live in New York or California, it was tuition free. That was in the 1960s, all the way into the 1970s. Tuition free. Northern Europe, tuition free. Now, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 in debt. And by the way, people of color, students who are people of color, have the highest debt. This is viewed as normal. Today, if you are poor or jobless, it's on you. It's your fault. You know, there used to be a talk about, poverty was the result of a structure of the economy, and we needed a war on poverty. We had to change the structure. Unemployment was not the fault of the unemployed worker. It meant there weren't enough jobs, and we need to create those jobs. That's out the window now. Now it's your fault if you don't have a job. This is an interesting one. If you're a public sector worker now, by definition, you are less valuable than a private sector worker because you don't make a profit. You live off of other people's taxes. This is an absolute reversal from the 1960s. Anybody here remember the movie The Graduate? Do you remember one of the punchlines in it? Plastics. It was a joke to think that all your life was aimed towards working in the plastics industry. Instead, public sector work was a higher calling. This is what the Kennedys were asking us, to serve our country. Working in the public sector, working in schools, social work, even working in the post office. These were viewed as good, positive jobs. Look at the way it's changed now. And finally, if you do want a poverty program, we have one for you. It's called jail. Let me show you how all this fits together. Here's a little data for you. Here's student loans. As runaway inequality increased, so did the total amount of student loans. It's a $1.5 trillion industry now. Our students and our families are being financially strip-mined right now. Now, another indication, I'm giving you some data here, is one way to measure how good our social safety net is how much child poverty do we have. So let's look at a comparison of countries around the world. The country with the most children living in relative poverty is Romania. Who's number 2? Us. Here's the rest of the world. The countries at the top, they're the ones with the least inequality. Lower inequality, lower children living in poverty. Now, let's take a look at youth unemployment today. You would think this is something we want to do about it. Right now, these are high school graduates who are either unemployed or underemployed. Underemployed means they have a part-time job and they want a full-time job. About 50% of African American youth are in this category. Latino, 36%. Anglo, almost 34%. That's pretty much a universal problem. You would think we'd want to do something about this. You would think we would have programs that were job creation for youth, high school graduates, the kids that did what we asked them to do. Stay in school, get a job. You think we'd be working on that. Here's what we've done instead. We don't have any programs for them. Instead, we have prisons. Let me walk you through the prison growth. By the way, this chart looks exactly the same as if we do percentage of the population as opposed to raw numbers. 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940s, 1950s. Now wait, here comes the 1960s, sex, drugs, rock and roll. We were a lawless bunch back there. Watch this. What? Went up a little bit. Here comes 1970s, we were still stoned. The same. Now, watch what happens when runaway inequality kicks in. This is unbelievable. We have the most prisoners in the entire world, more than China, Russia, a higher percentage than Cuba, than North Korea. We lead the world in prisoners because this is where we've warehoused our young people. The average wage of someone going into prison is like $20,000 a year. Average. Poor people are in prison. This is where we put them. Now, the other thing that happens to a lot of our people now is they're basically killing themselves. That's the opiate drug deaths since runaway inequality hit. Now, we all know that racism is an enormous problem in this country and that it's connected to runaway inequality. But let me show you the other side of the connection, how runaway inequality leads to racial difficulties. If you recall, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, was killed by the police. What was going on in Ferguson, Missouri? There's an incredible Justice Department report that looked at the 25 communities around St. Louis about how they were raising their money. They all raised some of their money from fines and forfeitures. What's that? You stop people on the street, you give them a ticket for something or another, you get them in the court system, they have to pay fees, or they have to pay for because a light was out, or they jaywalked, and all these towns collect some money for that. Here's Ferguson, Missouri. From 2004 till roughly a little after the crash, about 7-8% of their revenues came from fines and forfeitures. But corporations weren't paying, the wealthy weren't paying, there was a crisis going on, so they went to their police and said, go out there and raise more money. Stop more people on the street and get them in the criminal justice system. That's what they told them to do. In 25 counties around St. Louis, they did the same. We think this is going on in thousands of counties. We don't really know what happened with Michael Brown, but we do know the police were trying to stop more people. Something happened there. He ends up dead. There's a connection here. When you turn your police into revenue generators and asking them for more confrontations on the street, something bad's going to happen. And you know what? It's going to happen to the people who are the poorest, usually. All right, that's the sad part of this story and the bad part of this story. Let's try to end on an uplifting note, if I can. We got to do something about this. What do we do to stop the financial strip mining? By the way, there are two words I want to put into the American lexicon. One is runaway inequality. That's two words right there. The second one is financial strip mining. That's two more words. Runaway inequality, financial strip mining. Those two phrases we need to make sense of our world. So there's two takeaways from this talk. The first one is runaway inequality will not cure itself. There is no magic pendulum out there that's going to swing back and forth and, oh, don't worry, this tax cut's going to make things fair, or the next person that gets in is going to make things fair. Runaway inequality is built into the system now. If that is true, and I think that's absolutely true, if that is true, that leads us to a second takeaway. It's going to take a massive popular movement to counter runaway inequality. And this movement is so massive that we have no experience yet in our lifetimes for what that looks like. We have to go back a long way to see a movement strong enough to make this kind of change. And let me take you there for a second. Here's what we have instead. We have, before I take you there, let me show you what we do have. We have a lot of struggles going on. Here's the CWA, Verizon workers on strike. Yeah. Here's Black Lives Matter that grew up after Ferguson. Here's the People's Climate March that was going on. The Fight for 15. And I could show all the wonderful immigration struggles that have been going on. We have lots of movements. But except for Staten Island, they're in their own silos. And we're losing. These are incredible struggles. They are existential struggles. Black Lives Matter. People are fighting to stay alive. We're fighting to keep the planet alive. We're fighting for even the most basic decent wage. We're fighting for the right to have a union. These are very basic struggles. But if we fight them independently, we're going to lose. So we have to look to how we bring them together. And the last great movement that began was a populist movement, American populist movement in the 1880s and 1890s. This was really the last time that the American people took on Wall Street directly. And they were calling, this was an organization of small farmers, black and white, with some labor, that were getting absolutely crushed by Wall Street loans. And they fought back. And they argued for cooperatives. They wanted public ownership of the railroads, telegraph, grain elevators, stockyards, and they wanted public banks to get rid of Wall Street banks. Well, they didn't win, but they changed the tone of the country. From that point on, the idea of regulating corporate America became legitimate, and by the 1930s, we got the New Deal, which was largely the result of this first populist surge. And we also got one public bank out of this. Anybody know where it is? North Dakota. And yes, and we're going to be fighting for one just across the channel here in New Jersey. That public bank is the most profitable bank in terms of percentage in the country. Most profitable bank. So, and it's a public bank. It does things like, for every $100,000 it loans out, it demands that one new job be created in the state of North Dakota. And it's interesting, when I bring this up, someone, in more conservative groups, they'll say, well, wait a second, it was the oil shale. That's why they have such low unemployment there. They did. During the oil shale boom, they had the lowest rate of unemployment in the country, 2.8% or something. Well, now it's an oil bust. North Dakota still has the lowest unemployment rate in the country, largely because of its public bank. So it's a public bank. You can call up and get the salaries. So I called them up. This is what they look like. These are the top 6 officers. So I said, what's your entry-level person get there? They said $35,000 a year. Your average worker gets, full-time worker, $35,000, clerk or something. So quickly, I take out my trusty calculator, I do the math. What's the ratio between the top CEO and the average worker? 7 to 1. Exactly what the American people think is fair and just. They got there all on their own. You don't have to pay the top CEO of the most profitable bank in the country $30 million a year. And they interviewed him, and they said, well, why didn't you lose money during the crash when all these other banks were about to go under? He said, oh, yeah, they came to us, and they wanted to sell us all these CDOs and derivatives and all that, and we had no idea what they were talking about, so we didn't buy any. Okay, so let's look at the populist organizing strategy. They educated and they organized. And when they were done doing that, they organized and educated. They sent in the field 6,000 educators in the 1880s, 6,000 to build their movement. Singing a song not that different than the song I'm singing here, or at least trying to. They were probably more in tune. Okay, so we figured out, given population growth, we need something like 30,000 trainers. That's what we're trying to do now, is build an army of 30,000. We've got another, 29,700 to go, but we're on the way. Now, there are 4 things we need to do to build this movement, the likes of which we've never seen before. One is we need a common agenda and a common analysis. We don't think that's too hard to do. We think you in this room could build a common agenda for Staten Island, for New York, and for the country, and it wouldn't be that different than what we could do in other states. We're not that far off. We know we need universal health care, Medicare for all. We know we need free higher education. We know the basics of what we need. So that's a doable thing. We need to build the educational infrastructure. That's my pay grade. I've been blessed by the CWA backing this effort, and we're spreading it all over the country, inside CWA, other unions, et cetera. We think we can build this infrastructure. And we're going to be recruiting you today to join it. We also need a new state national movement that helps us get out of our silos and connect our silos. I am incredibly proud to be standing in front of something called Staten Island United. The first effort I know of to build this model. Now, imagine if we can go from Staten Island United to New York City United to New York United to America United, a dues-paying organization. I think we could have millions of people would be willing to put up $25 or $50 a year to join that kind of organization. That's how we build the movement that will change this country. Unfortunately, over my pay grade. Steve here? Steve's going to be part of building this. You got to represent something. I represent 5 people at the Labor Institute in New York. I don't qualify as someone who can bring people to the movement. But I think discussions have to start soon about how we build this. But here's the final thing. The final thing is the make or break thing. It's in our heads. We have to believe that we can be movement builders. You know, I talk about this and people go, oh, sure, yeah, right, yeah, tomorrow. He's out of his mind. We can't do this. We can only do it. I am out of my mind if you don't think we can do it. There needs to be an attitude change. In our heads, we have to believe that we're movement builders no matter what silo we're in. Whether we're in Black Lives Matter or CWA 1102, it doesn't matter where we are. Everybody's got to be a movement builder who's part of this, who wants to dramatically change this country. So getting inside of ourselves and recognizing wherever we go, we need to build this movement. That is the key. And that's what's been happening with our trainers and the people they train. I think that's what's starting to happen here in Staten Island. So that is key. So usually what happens when I get to the end, and I'm getting to the end here, you'll be happy to know, is I ask for people to join the Army of Educators. And I go, how many people want to be runaway inequality educators? Raise your hand. All right, that's what usually happens. Yeah, good, great. And normally I just walk out. I go, thank you very much. Join the effort. Good luck. I leave it to Steve and others to recruit everybody. Well, I did that before. I did that all over the country before Trump was elected. After Trump was elected, I said, that's not enough. We have to have an independent mechanism to help these other groups develop these trainers. So we started to recruit people and collect names. And we now have, that's a month or two old, these are all the people who are volunteering to be trainers. And this doesn't count the CWA and other union people. These are just people who wrote in. I read a lot of articles. I just put a little tagline at the end. If you want to join the Runaway Inequality Network, go to runawayinequality.org and sign up. That's what we have. Now, when I finish up here in a couple of minutes, we're going to have a couple of people here to give you a little sample of what the training is like. We train people to do what I just did, except without lecturing at all through small groups, looking at materials, and it's working out pretty well. So we're going to give you a taste of that. But we also want you to think a little bit about the commitment that you're making. You know, when I finish up these wraps, by this point in my life, I've done it enough where I could set you up to give me an applause, right? I could build this up to a crescendo. I've read enough speeches. I know how to do that. I ain't doing that anymore. I don't want an applause for me. I want us to applaud, but I want us to applaud each other for the commitment we're going to make to build a runaway inequality movement. That's what you should applaud. Thank you very much.